To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, welcome and thank you. Your presence makes these stories worth sharing. We'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Discovery. Derek Holloway had always possessed an unsettling ability to read people. 20 years in military intelligence, followed by another decade in private security consulting, had honed his skills to an almost supernatural level. He could detect lies in a person's micro-expressions, identify threats before they materialized, and most importantly, he could wait. Derek understood that patience was the deadliest weapon in any arsenal. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening in March. Brenda, his wife of 16 years, had started wearing perfume to her yoga classes. Not unusual for most women, but Brenda had always been practical to a fault. She'd stopped trying to impress Derek years ago, settling into the comfortable indifference that many marriages developed. But perfume for yoga? That required closer observation. Derek's background had taught him to gather intelligence before making any moves. For 3 weeks, he watched. Brenda's phone buzzed with messages she quickly dismissed. She started working late at the insurance office where she'd been employed for 8 years. Her laptop, which used to remain open on the kitchen counter, now traveled with her everywhere. The confirmation came when Derek installed a small tracking device on her car, a piece of equipment left over from his consulting days. Instead of driving to the Serenity Yoga Studio on Elm Street, Brenda's car spent 2 hours every Tuesday and Thursday evening parked outside the Riverside Motel on Highway 9. Derek felt no anger, no betrayal, no sadness. Those emotions belonged to ordinary men who reacted impulsively to life's cruelties. Derek was a planner, a strategist. He felt only the cold satisfaction of having his suspicions confirmed and the anticipation of what would come next. 3 days later, Derek positioned himself in the motel's parking lot with military-grade surveillance equipment. Through the telephoto lens, he captured Brenda emerging from room 247 with Troy Madsen, a local contractor who'd done work on their house the previous summer. Troy was married with twin daughters, a detail that would prove useful later. Derek had encountered Troy during the bathroom renovation. The man was loud, arrogant, and prone to cutting corners. Exactly the type of person Derek despised. Troy treated his crew poorly, overcharged clients, and had made several inappropriate comments about Brenda during the work. Derek had filed away every detail, as was his habit. But the most damaging revelation came that weekend. Derek's son Kyle, now 19 and home from college, sat at the kitchen table scrolling through his phone while Derek prepared breakfast. "Dad, you know Mom's been acting weird lately," Kyle said without looking up. Derek continued cracking eggs. "How so?" "She's been talking to Troy Madsen a lot. Like, a lot. She thinks I don't notice, but she's always texting someone and smiling." Kyle finally looked up. "Plus, she asked me if I thought you and her might be happier apart." The final piece clicked into place. Brenda wasn't just having an affair, she was preparing to leave. And she was using their son to gauge Derek's potential reaction. That night, Derek sat in his study reviewing everything he'd learned. Brenda and Troy had been meeting for at least 6 weeks. They'd grown careless, believing Derek was too absorbed in his work to notice. Kyle either supported the affair or was being manipulated by his mother. Either way, Derek's son had chosen a side, and it wasn't his father's. Derek opened his laptop and began making a list. Names, addresses, financial information, psychological profiles. In the military, they called it building a target package. Every successful operation required thorough intelligence gathering and careful planning. By dawn, Derek had outlined a plan that would systematically destroy every person who had betrayed him. The beauty of his approach lay not in its immediate brutality, but in its methodical precision. He would manipulate events so that his enemies would destroy themselves, never realizing they were dancing to his tune. Derek Holloway had spent decades learning how to hunt dangerous people in foreign countries. Hunting them in his own backyard would be infinitely easier. The game had begun. Chapter 2. The Setup. Derek's first move was deceptively simple. He started being the perfect husband. For 2 weeks, he brought Brenda flowers, cooked dinner without being asked, and expressed interest in her day with an enthusiasm he hadn't shown in years. Brenda, caught off guard by this sudden attention, became visibly uncomfortable. Derek could see her struggling to reconcile her affair with his newfound devotion. You don't have to try so hard, she told him one evening as he massaged her shoulders. We're fine the way we are. I've been thinking about us, Derek replied, his hands working knots from her neck with practiced skill. About what we could be. I want to make things better. Brenda tensed. Derek, I know I've been distant. Work has consumed too much of my time. But I want to change that. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head. I love you, Brenda. I want to fight for us. The psychological warfare was devastating. Derek watched as guilt and confusion warred across Brenda's face. She'd expected distance, maybe suspicion. Instead, she was receiving the attention she'd craved for years, just as she'd committed to leaving him for another man. Meanwhile, Derek was busy with other preparations. He'd maintained contacts throughout the intelligence community, men and women who owed him favors or shared his particular skill set. A few phone calls brought him access to resources that most people couldn't imagine. His first target was Troy Madsen. Derek's research revealed that Troy's construction business was barely surviving. He'd leveraged everything to buy equipment he couldn't afford, taken on projects beyond his capability, and was 3 months behind on his business loan. Troy was desperate, which made him predictable. Derek created a shell company and approached Troy about a massive renovation project for a private client who demanded absolute discretion. The job would pay $180,000, enough to solve all of Troy's financial problems. There was just one catch. The work had to be completed using specific materials sourced from a particular supplier, and payment would only be made upon completion. The supplier was another shell company controlled by Derek. The materials were legitimate but came with hidden costs that would bankrupt Troy's business if he couldn't complete the project. More importantly, the chemicals involved in the special paint and sealants had properties that would become relevant later. Troy, desperate and arrogant, signed the contract without proper legal review. He bragged to Brenda about the windfall, telling her they'd soon have enough money to start fresh in another state. Derek listened to their recorded phone conversations with cold satisfaction. Kyle's betrayal required a different approach. Derek had always provided generously for his son's college expenses, but Kyle had developed expensive tastes. Designer clothes, expensive gadgets, spring break trips to Mexico, all funded by Derek's consulting income. Kyle took this support for granted while actively working against his father. Derek began monitoring Kyle's social media and discovered his son was involved in activities that would horrify any parent. Underage drinking, drug use, and association with a group that had been investigated for hazing incidents. Kyle was also failing 2 of his classes despite Derek paying full tuition. Rather than confronting Kyle directly, Derek started subtly reducing his financial support. A credit card got accidentally frozen. A tuition payment was delayed. Kyle, panicked about maintaining his lifestyle, began calling his mother for additional money. Brenda, already stressed about her double life, became increasingly irritable as Kyle's demands escalated. Derek could hear them arguing through the walls, mother and son fighting over money while planning to abandon the man who provided it. The final piece of Derek's setup involved his own reputation. He began telling carefully selected colleagues about his marital problems, portraying himself as a devoted husband trying to save his relationship. He spoke about Brenda's distance, his suspicions about another man, and his desperate desire to rebuild their connection. By the time Derek's plan reached its next phase, he'd constructed a narrative where he was the sympathetic victim trying to save his marriage while his wife and son conspired against him. When the truth eventually emerged, public opinion would be entirely on his side. 3 weeks after discovering the affair, Derek received confirmation that all pieces were in position. Troy had started the renovation project and was already encountering the costly surprises Derek had built into the contract. Brenda was growing increasingly anxious as her guilt over Derek's renewed attention clashed with her excitement about leaving. Kyle was drowning in debt and becoming more desperate for money. Derek sat in his study that night, reviewing surveillance photos and financial documents. His enemies had no idea they were already trapped. They thought they were making choices, but Derek was controlling every option available to them. The psychological warfare was about to escalate into something far more dangerous. Chapter 3. The Eviction. The explosion happened at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Derek was in his study when the house shook violently. Car alarms erupted throughout the neighborhood as windows rattled in their frames. He walked calmly to the front window and observed a massive fireball consuming what had been Troy Madsen's work truck, parked 3 blocks away. Within minutes, sirens filled the night air. Derek watched emergency vehicles race toward the scene while he poured himself a scotch. The truck had been loaded with the special materials from his shell company supplier, materials that became highly volatile when mixed incorrectly. Troy's arrogance and cost-cutting measures had finally caught up with him. The timing was perfect. In 6 hours, Derek would be called away on an emergency consulting job that would take him out of state for 2 weeks. By the time he returned, the final act would be ready to begin. Derek's phone buzzed with a text from Brenda. "Did you hear that explosion?" "I'm scared," he texted back. "Probably just an accident. Try to get some sleep. I love you." By morning, the local news was reporting that Troy Madsen had been critically injured in a construction accident. Initial investigations suggested improper storage of volatile materials. Troy was in a medically induced coma at Regional Medical Center with severe burns covering 60% of his body. Derek received his emergency call at exactly 9 a.m. A client in Nevada needed immediate security consultation for a situation that couldn't wait. He kissed Brenda goodbye, noting how she barely looked up from her phone. She was undoubtedly trying to get information about Troy's condition. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," Derek told her. "Try not to burn the house down while I'm gone." Brenda finally looked at him. "That's not funny, considering what happened to that contractor." "You're right. Poor choice of words." Derek studied her face. "You seem upset about a man you barely know." "It's just terrible, that's all. He has a family." Derek nodded sympathetically and left for his flight. 2 weeks later, Derek returned home with evidence that his wife had spent every night at the Riverside Motel, waiting for Troy to recover. She'd maxed out credit cards paying for his medical expenses and had been seen arguing with Troy's wife at the hospital. The other woman had discovered the affair and threatened to expose everything to Derek. More importantly, Kyle had dropped out of college. Without Derek's financial support, and with Brenda spending everything on Troy's medical bills, Kyle couldn't afford tuition. He'd moved back home and was working at a local garage, bitter and resentful about his changed circumstances. Derek's return was met with cold silence. Brenda had transformed from guilty and conflicted to openly hostile. Kyle barely acknowledged his presence. The house felt like enemy territory. Derek began documenting everything. Hidden cameras captured Brenda's phone conversations with Troy, who was slowly recovering but facing massive medical debt. Audio recordings revealed Kyle's resentment and his plan to move in with friends as soon as possible. Both his wife and son spoke about Derek with open contempt, discussing him as an obstacle to their happiness. 3 days after his return, Derek initiated the final phase. He hired a divorce attorney and had Brenda serve with papers at her office. He simultaneously filed for emergency custody modification regarding Kyle, citing his son's drug use and academic failure. Most importantly, he activated restraining orders against both Brenda and Kyle, claiming he'd discovered evidence of planned violence against him. The restraining orders were based on carefully edited recordings and doctored evidence that painted Brenda and Kyle as unstable and dangerous. Derek's reputation in the intelligence community lent credibility to his claims, and judges were inclined to err on the side of caution when dealing with potential domestic violence. When Brenda arrived home that evening, she found Derek calmly packing a suitcase while Kyle laughed in the background. "Get out before I call security," she said coldly, waving the divorce papers. Kyle grinned maliciously, finally getting rid of the deadbeat. Derek quietly took his suitcase and left without a word. He could have explained that the restraining orders gave him legal grounds to have them both arrested if they remained in the house. He could have mentioned that his divorce attorney had frozen their joint accounts and filed liens against Brenda's assets. He could have revealed that Kyle was about to be expelled from his community college for unpaid debts. Instead, Derek drove to a hotel and waited. 2 hours later, the convoy arrived. Federal agents, local police, and specialized security personnel surrounded the house. Derek watched from his car as the lead officer knocked on the door. "Ma'am, this property is now under federal protection. You have 10 minutes to evacuate." Through his surveillance equipment, Derek heard Brenda scream into her phone, "What the hell did you do?" But Derek wasn't there to answer. He was already planning the next move in a game that his enemies were finally beginning to understand they could never win. Chapter 4. The Network. Derek's hotel room resembled a military command center. 3 laptops displayed surveillance feeds, financial records, and communication intercepts. Wall-mounted monitors showed news coverage of the Federal Protection incident, while encrypted phones connected him to contacts across multiple government agencies. The truth behind the federal intervention was both simpler and more complex than anyone imagined. Derek hadn't fabricated a terrorist threat or invented foreign espionage. Instead, he'd exploited an existing investigation that most people had forgotten about. 2 years earlier, Derek's consulting firm had provided security analysis for a Department of Homeland Security investigation into potential vulnerabilities in local infrastructure. The study had identified several high-value targets, including the power grid, water treatment facilities, and telecommunications hubs. One recommendation had been to establish protocols for protecting key personnel who might become targets of foreign agents seeking to exploit infrastructure weaknesses. Derek's house, due to his intelligence background and current consulting contracts, had been designated as a potential target location requiring federal protection if credible threats emerged. The designation had been buried in classified paperwork and forgotten by everyone except Derek. 3 months ago, Derek had begun feeding carefully crafted intelligence reports to his government contacts. Anonymous tips about suspicious individuals conducting surveillance of infrastructure targets. Intercepted communications suggesting foreign interest in local facilities. None of it was false. Derek simply aggregated real intelligence and pointed it toward his own neighborhood. When federal agents monitored the area, they observed Troy Madsen's truck parked near a telecommunications facility on multiple occasions. They documented Brenda's frequent visits to the Riverside Motel, which happened to be located adjacent to a power substation. They noted Kyle's association with a group of college students whose social media posts included photos taken near sensitive locations. Derek's enemies had unknowingly created a pattern that appeared consistent with foreign surveillance operations. The explosion of Troy's truck, loaded with industrial chemicals, had triggered automatic protection protocols. Federal agencies moved to secure the area and evacuate potential targets. Brenda and Kyle found themselves homeless, but that was only the beginning of their problems. Derek's second phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Lucia Rodriguez, a former CIA operative who now ran a private intelligence firm. Derek had saved her life in Afghanistan, and she'd spent the last decade repaying that debt. Target packages complete, the message read. Awaiting final authorization. Derek smiled and typed back. Execute all phases. Within hours, Troy Madsen's world collapsed entirely. His business accounts were frozen pending investigation into irregularities discovered during the insurance review of his truck explosion. The insurance company had hired Lucia's firm to investigate potential fraud, and her team had uncovered a pattern of equipment theft, tax evasion, and worker safety violations stretching back 5 years. Troy, still recovering from his injuries, was arrested at the hospital. His wife filed for divorce, taking their twin daughters and what remained of their assets. His business partners abandoned him, and his medical bills continued mounting while insurance claims were suspended pending criminal investigation. Brenda's situation was equally devastating. Derek's divorce attorney had invoked emergency provisions that froze her access to joint accounts while allegations of adultery and asset concealment were investigated. Her employment was terminated when her insurance company discovered she'd been using company resources to investigate Derek's background, an invasion of privacy that violated multiple professional ethics regulations. The Riverside Motel became uninhabitable when health inspectors, acting on anonymous tips, discovered extensive code violations. The building was condemned, and several guests were treated for exposure to toxic mold. Brenda, who'd been staying there since the evacuation, was forced to seek shelter with distant relatives who barely tolerated her presence. Kyle's descent was the most satisfying for Derek to observe. Without family financial support, Kyle had borrowed money from dangerous people to maintain his lifestyle. When Derek's contacts and local law enforcement began investigating Kyle's college friend group, several members were arrested on drug possession charges. Kyle, desperate to avoid prosecution, had agreed to provide information about his associates' activities. The problem was that Kyle knew nothing useful, and his new friends in the criminal underworld didn't appreciate informants. Derek watched through surveillance cameras as Kyle moved from one temporary location to another, looking over his shoulder constantly and growing more paranoid with each passing day. Derek's phone rang with a call from his attorney. The federal protection order expires in 72 hours, the lawyer reported. Your wife's attorney is demanding access to the house for property removal. Denied, Derek replied. File for extension based on ongoing security concerns. Derek, we need to talk about your endgame here. This level of federal involvement is raising questions. People are starting to wonder. Derek ended the call. His attorney was becoming nervous, which meant the man was starting to understand the scope of Derek's capabilities. That made him a potential liability. Derek's final phone buzzed with a message from Kyle. Dad, I need help. People are trying to hurt me. Mom won't answer her phone. Please. Derek stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. His son had made his choice when he laughed about getting rid of his deadbeat father. Brenda had made her choice when she decided Troy Madsen was worth more than 16 years of marriage. Troy had made his choice when he decided to seduce another man's wife. Derek's choices had been made long ago, in places where mercy was weakness and forgiveness was suicide. He'd spent decades learning that some people were predators and others were prey. When you showed predators mercy, they interpreted it as weakness and attacked again. None of his enemies would receive a second chance to betray him. The real game was just beginning. Chapter 5, The Hunt. Derek's war room had expanded to encompass the entire hotel suite. Financial records covered every surface, surveillance photos lined the walls, and multiple phone lines buzzed with constant updates from his network of contacts. He'd transformed from a betrayed husband into something far more dangerous, a predator with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Brenda's attempt to fight back had been pathetically predictable. She'd hired a private investigator to dig into Derek's background, hoping to find evidence of infidelity or financial misconduct. The investigator, a former police detective named Carl Washington, had lasted exactly 3 days before Derek's countermeasures destroyed his career. Carl had made the mistake of accessing databases without proper authorization while investigating Derek. Within 48 hours, Internal Affairs was reviewing Carl's entire case history, discovering a pattern of procedural violations and evidence tampering that dated back years. Carl's PI license was suspended, his assets frozen, and he found himself facing criminal charges. Brenda, now without legal representation she could afford, had turned to Kyle for emotional support. But Kyle was dealing with his own escalating problems. The young man Derek had raised and provided for was now sleeping in his car, too paranoid to stay in any location for more than a few hours. Derek's contacts had spread word through the local criminal network that Kyle was cooperating with federal investigations. In reality, Kyle knew nothing useful, but perception was everything in that world. Low-level dealers and gang associates who'd never heard of Kyle Holloway now viewed him as a threat to their operations. The psychological pressure was deliberate and devastating. Derek had learned in military interrogations that direct violence was often less effective than sustained psychological stress. Let people destroy themselves through fear and desperation, and they'd accomplish what torture never could. Troy Madsen's situation had evolved from critical to impossible. Still recovering from his burns, Troy faced federal charges related to the transportation of hazardous materials. The explosion had been reclassified as an act of criminal negligence after investigators discovered Troy had ignored multiple safety protocols. More damaging was the revelation that Troy's construction company had been systematically defrauding clients. Derek's shell company had provided investigators with detailed records of overcharging, substandard materials, and building code violations. What appeared to be a spontaneous investigation was actually the result of Derek's careful documentation over months of planning. Troy's wife had not only filed for divorce, but was cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for immunity from charges related to the business fraud. She'd provided investigators with records showing that she'd been aware of Troy's illegal activities and had helped conceal assets from the IRS. The irony was exquisite. Troy had destroyed his marriage pursuing Brenda, only to have his wife destroy him in return. Derek's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Lucia Rodriguez. Phase 3 complete. Targets are isolated and vulnerable. Ready for final phase? Derek typed back. Not yet. Let them suffer longer. The suffering was indeed intensifying. Brenda had been evicted from her relative's home after Kyle's criminal associates were spotted surveilling the property. The family had decided that harboring Brenda wasn't worth the risk to their own safety. Brenda was now staying at a women's shelter, working a minimum wage job at a convenience store, and walking to work because she couldn't afford car repairs. The woman who'd once enjoyed middle-class comfort and security was learning what desperation felt like. Kyle's situation had become truly dangerous. Derek's surveillance showed his son being followed by multiple groups, federal agents investigating his alleged cooperation, local criminals who viewed him as a threat, and Derek's own people who were documenting his every move. Kyle had tried reaching out to old friends, but Derek's intelligence network had poisoned those relationships. Carefully planted rumors suggested Kyle was unstable, violent, and involved with dangerous people. Former friends and roommates wanted nothing to do with him. The young man was cracking under the pressure. Derek's audio surveillance captured Kyle talking to himself, paranoid ramblings about being watched and hunted. Kyle had started drinking heavily and was showing signs of serious psychological breakdown. Derek felt no sympathy. Kyle had chosen to side with Brenda and Troy against his own father. He'd laughed about getting rid of the deadbeat who'd provided for him his entire life. Kyle was discovering what life looked like without Derek's protection and support. The most satisfying development was watching his enemies turn against each other. Brenda blamed Kyle for their current situation, claiming his cooperation with investigators had brought federal attention to their family. Kyle blamed Brenda for starting the affair that destroyed their comfortable life. Troy, facing years in federal prison, had begun providing investigators with information about his affair with Brenda. He was claiming she'd encouraged him to cut corners on construction projects and had known about his business fraud. Troy was trying to reduce his sentence by portraying Brenda as a co-conspirator. Derek's phone rang with a call from a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Dad." Kyle's voice was barely recognizable, hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "I know you're listening. I know you can hear me." Derek remained silent. "I know what you're doing," Kyle continued. "I know you're behind all of this. Please, just stop. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything." Derek ended the call and immediately contacted his technical team to trace the number. Kyle had used a burner phone purchased with cash, showing he'd learned something about operational security. But it was too little, too late. Derek's war had entered its final phase. His enemies were broken, isolated, and turning against each other. Soon, it would be time to appear in person and deliver the final blow. But first, they needed to suffer just a little bit longer. Chapter 6: The Closing Net. The federal protection order expired on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after Derek's enemies had demanded his eviction. He returned to his house to find it exactly as he'd left it, every possession in place, every room undisturbed. The federal agents had protected his property better than any security system could have. Derek spent the morning reviewing final reports from his network. The intelligence was overwhelming. Brenda living in a shelter, Kyle sleeping in his car, Troy facing 20 years in federal prison. His enemies were destroyed, but Derek wasn't finished. Destruction wasn't enough. He wanted acknowledgement, confession, and absolute surrender. His first visitor arrived at 2 p.m. Kyle stood on the front porch, looking like a ghost of the arrogant young man who'd laughed about getting rid of his father. 3 weeks of constant fear had aged him years. His clothes were dirty, his face gaunt, and his hands shook with exhaustion. Derek opened the door, but didn't invite Kyle inside. "I know what you did," Kyle said without preamble. "I know you planned all of this." "Did I?" Derek's voice was calm, emotionless. "Seems like you and your mother created your own problems. The federal agents, the investigation, Troy's accident. You orchestrated everything." Kyle's voice cracked. "I've been thinking about it for weeks." The timing was too perfect. Derek studied his son's face. Kyle had always been intelligent, but that intelligence had been wasted on entitlement and selfishness. 3 weeks of survival had apparently focused his mind. "Even if that were true," Derek said slowly, "why would you think I'd help you now?" "Because I'm your son." Derek felt something cold and final settle in his chest. "You were my son. You chose to side with the people who betrayed me. You laughed when they threw me out of my own house. I was angry. I didn't understand. You understood perfectly. You thought your mother and her lover were going to provide a better life than I could. You were wrong." Kyle's face crumpled. "I'm sorry. God, Dad, I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. Please." Derek stepped back and began closing the door. "Mistakes have consequences. You're living with yours." They're going to kill me, Kyle shouted as the door closed. The people you sent, they're going to kill me. Derek locked the door and walked away. Kyle pounded on the wood for several minutes before giving up. Through surveillance cameras, Derek watched his son stumble back to his battered car and drive away. An hour later, Brenda arrived. She looked worse than Kyle. The woman who'd once taken pride in her appearance now wore thrift store clothes and carried herself with the defeated posture of someone who'd lost everything. But her eyes still held defiance. "You destroyed my life," she said when Derek opened the door. "You destroyed your own life. I just documented the process. Troy could die in prison. Kyle is having a nervous breakdown. All because you couldn't handle me finding someone who actually cared about me." Derek studied her face, searching for any sign of the woman he'd once loved. She was gone, replaced by someone who blamed others for the consequences of her own choices. Troy is in prison because he's a criminal. Kyle is having a breakdown because he's weak. You're homeless because you chose to betray the man who provided for you. Derek's voice remained level. "I didn't create any of those problems. I just stopped protecting you from the consequences. We were unhappy. You were never here, never present. I found someone who. You found someone who told you what you wanted to hear while planning to leave his own wife and children. Troy wasn't rescuing you, Brenda. He was using you." The truth hit her like a physical blow. Derek could see the realization forming. Troy had never intended to leave his family permanently. The affair had been temporary entertainment, not a new beginning. "You could have just divorced me," Brenda whispered. "You didn't have to destroy everyone. I could have, but you chose to involve Kyle in your betrayal. You chose to turn my son against me. That made it personal." Derek stepped back and began closing the door. "Don't come here again. You're not welcome." "Derek, please. I know you're angry, but I'm not angry. Anger is an emotion for people who still care. You and Kyle and Troy are just problems I solved." The door closed with finality. Derek returned to his study and reviewed the surveillance feeds. Both Kyle and Brenda had left the property, but they'd be back. Desperate people always came back, hoping for mercy from the people they'd wronged. His phone buzzed with a message from Lucia Rodriguez. Local law enforcement requesting federal assistance with Kyle Holloway investigation. Multiple agency interest. Derek typed back, "Approved. Let them find him." The net was closing completely. Kyle's paranoid behavior and association with criminal elements had attracted genuine law enforcement attention. His own choices were driving him toward arrest, or worse. Derek poured himself a scotch and sat in his leather chair, surrounded by the evidence of his victory. 16 years of marriage, 19 years of fatherhood, and a lifetime of loyalty had been repaid with betrayal and mockery. His enemies had demanded he leave his own house. Now they were learning what life looked like when Derek Holloway stopped protecting them from the world's cruelties. The game was almost over. Chapter 7. The Final Truth. Derek's doorbell rang at 3 a.m., accompanied by desperate pounding that echoed through the house. He checked the surveillance feed and saw Kyle and Brenda standing together on his porch, both looking desperate and terrified. Kyle was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, and Brenda's clothes were torn. Derek activated the intercom system. "Go away. Dad, please." Kyle's voice was raw with panic. "They tried to kill me tonight. Brenda pulled me out of the car before they could finish. We need help," Brenda added. "Whatever you think of us, we're still family." Derek considered his options. His enemies were broken, desperate, and finally willing to acknowledge their complete dependence on him. This was the moment he'd been orchestrating for months. He opened the door. Kyle collapsed against the door frame, exhaustion overcoming adrenaline. "They put a bomb under my car. If Mom hadn't seen the wires." Derek examined Kyle's injury with clinical detachment. The cut was superficial but had bled impressively. "Who put a bomb under your car?" "I don't know. People who think I'm an informant. People who want me dead because of something you did." Kyle's eyes held a mixture of fear and accusation. Derek guided them into the living room and closed the door. For the first time in weeks, all three members of the Holloway family were in the same room. "Let me explain something to both of you," Derek said, settling into his chair while Kyle and Brenda huddled together on the couch. "The people trying to kill Kyle aren't working for me. They're working for themselves, trying to eliminate what they perceive as a threat to their operations." "But you created the perception," Brenda said quietly. "You made them think Kyle was informing. I provided accurate information to law enforcement about Kyle's associations and activities. What Kyle's new friends did with that information was their choice. Derek walked to his desk and retrieved a thick folder. Since you're both here, let me share some facts you might find interesting. He opened the folder and spread photographs across the coffee table. Images of Troy with multiple women, financial records showing systematic theft from clients, documentation of unsafe construction practices that had injured workers. Troy Madsen isn't in prison because of me, Derek explained. He's in prison because he's a career criminal who finally got caught. The explosion that injured him was caused by his own negligence and corner cutting. Derek placed another set of documents on the table. These are records of Kyle's activities over the past year. Drug use, academic failure, association with known criminals, and theft from his employer. I didn't create these problems. I simply documented them. Kyle stared at the evidence of his own failures. You were watching me. I watch everyone who might become a threat. It's what keeps me alive in my profession. Derek turned to Brenda. And these are records of your affair, your embezzlement from petty cash at work to pay for hotel rooms, and your attempts to investigate my background using company resources. Brenda's face went white. I never embezzled. $47.32 over 6 months. Petty cash discrepancies that coincided exactly with your hotel visits. Your employer fired you for multiple violations, not just the privacy invasion. Derek gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. I didn't destroy your lives. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. So what happens now? Kyle asked. Derek studied his son's face, searching for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding. What he saw was still primarily self-interest. Kyle was sorry he'd been caught, sorry he was suffering consequences, but not genuinely sorry for his betrayal. Now you both leave, Derek said quietly. You're not my family anymore. You made that choice when you chose to betray me. Derek, please. Brenda stood up, her hands clasped in supplication. I know we hurt you. I know we made terrible mistakes. But Kyle is your son. Whatever you think of me, don't destroy him. Kyle destroyed himself. I just stopped enabling his destruction. Kyle rose shakily to his feet. What about the people trying to kill me? That's your problem to solve. You created enemies through your own actions. Deal with the consequences. Derek walked to the front door and opened it. Dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the sky pale gray. Both of you need to leave now. Don't come back. Brenda turned back once more. The man I married wouldn't have done this. You've become something terrible. Derek met her eyes without emotion. The man you married was weak. He forgave betrayal and enabled parasites. That man is dead. You killed him. Kyle and Brenda walked out into the gray morning, supporting each other like survivors of a disaster. Derek watched them reach Kyle's battered car and drive away. He closed the door and locked it, then returned to his study. On his desk lay a plane ticket to Prague, where a new consulting contract awaited. Derek's skills were in demand worldwide, and he'd grown tired of suburban life. His phone buzzed with a final message from Lucia Rodriguez. Cleanup complete. All loose ends resolved. Derek deleted the message and began packing. The house would be sold, the proceeds transferred to offshore accounts. Kyle and Brenda would never find him again. As Derek packed his clothes, he reflected on the lessons of the past months. Loyalty was a currency that could only be spent once. Betrayal was a choice that defined character permanently. And mercy, in a world full of predators, was just another word for weakness. Derek Holloway had learned those lessons in foreign wars and brought them home to suburban America. His enemies had discovered too late that some battles could never be won once you'd chosen the wrong side. The game was over. Derek had won completely. Chapter 8. No quarter. 3 months after Derek left for Prague, Kyle Holloway's body was found in a burned-out car on the outskirts of town. The official cause of death was listed as probable suicide, though forensic evidence suggested otherwise. Local police, overwhelmed with more pressing cases, didn't investigate thoroughly. Derek learned of his son's death through a secure communication channel while reviewing contracts in his Prague hotel room. He felt nothing, no grief, no regret, no satisfaction. Kyle had become a liability to dangerous people and had paid the inevitable price. The same week, Brenda was arrested for check fraud. Desperate and homeless, she'd been writing bad checks to survive. She was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, where she would have time to reflect on the choices that had destroyed her life. Troy Madsen died in federal prison 6 months later. A heart attack, officially, though Derek's sources suggested it was helped along by fellow inmates who didn't appreciate child predators. The investigation into Troy's construction business had uncovered evidence of unsafe work at a daycare center, leading to additional charges that branded him as someone who endangered children. Derek read these updates without emotion while sipping coffee in a Prague cafe. His enemies had destroyed themselves exactly as he'd predicted. The only surprise was how quickly Kyle had died. Derek had expected his son to survive longer. A year later, Derek returned to the United States for a consultation in Washington, D.C. While there, he decided to visit his old neighborhood. The house had been sold to a young family with 2 small children. Derek watched from his rental car as the father played catch with his son in the front yard while the mother gardened. They looked happy, content with their simple suburban life. Derek's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Is this Derek Holloway?" The voice was female, elderly. "Who's asking?" "This is Margaret Chun, Kyle's grandmother. Brenda's mother." Derek remembered the woman vaguely. She'd attended family gatherings occasionally, but had never shown much interest in Derek or Kyle. "I'm calling about Kyle's funeral," Margaret continued. "We're having a small service next week. I thought you should know. Kyle's been dead for over a year." "I know. It took time to arrange things, to save money. Brenda's still in jail, and there was no one else to." Derek ended the call without responding. He blocked the number and deleted the contact. As Derek drove away from his former neighborhood, he reflected on the completeness of his victory. His enemies were dead, imprisoned, or forgotten. The house where they'd betrayed him now sheltered a family that would never know its history. Derek had learned long ago that the world was divided into predators and prey. Those who showed mercy to predators invariably became prey themselves. Kyle and Brenda had been predators who'd mistaken Derek's civilized behavior for weakness. They'd discovered their error too late. Derek's phone buzzed with a message about a new contract in Eastern Europe. The client was offering substantial payment for problem resolution services that required Derek's particular expertise. He accepted the contract and drove toward the airport. The past was buried with Kyle's remains. Derek Holloway had more important work to do. 3 years later, Derek received a package at his secure mailing address in Switzerland. Inside was a newspaper clipping announcing Brenda's death. She'd been found in a homeless shelter, dead from a drug overdose. The accompanying note was unsigned. "Thought you should know. A friend." Derek burned the clipping without reading it completely. Brenda's death meant nothing to him. She'd ceased to exist as a person the moment she'd betrayed him. Derek's transformation was complete. The suburban husband and father was gone, replaced by someone who understood that loyalty was earned through strength and betrayal was punished without mercy. In the mountains of Switzerland, Derek continued his work. Governments and corporations paid him extraordinary sums to resolve problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. His reputation in the intelligence community had evolved from competent professional to something approaching legend. Sometimes, late at night in his secure compound, Derek would remember fragments of his old life. Kyle's first steps, Brenda's laugh during their early marriage, quiet Sunday mornings in suburban America. But those memories belonged to a different man, a weaker man who'd believed in forgiveness and second chances. Derek had learned that such beliefs were luxuries that predators exploited and prey couldn't afford. The hunter had emerged victorious, and the prey had learned too late that some games could only end one way. Derek Holloway lived by a simple code now: trust no one completely, forgive no betrayal, and always be the most dangerous person in any room. It was a philosophy that had served him well in the darkness beyond suburban comfort, and it would serve him until the day he died. Chapter 9: The Legacy. 5 years after the destruction of his family, Derek Holloway sat in a Swiss cafe reading about a case that reminded him of his own story. A businessman in Chicago had discovered his wife's affair and was seeking revenge through the legal system. The man was making mistakes Derek had avoided. He was acting emotionally, telegraphing his moves, and trusting the system to deliver justice. Derek felt no urge to intervene or offer advice. The world was full of weak men who learned too late that mercy was vulnerability. This particular businessman would likely lose everything because he couldn't commit to the ruthlessness that victory required. Derek's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his current client, a Fortune 500 CEO whose business partner had been embezzling millions. The partner was now missing, along with his family, and would never be found. Derek's methods had evolved far beyond the psychological warfare he'd used against Kyle and Brenda. Sometimes Derek wondered if he'd become something monstrous, but the thought never troubled him for long. Monsters were creatures that acted without reason or purpose. Derek acted with perfect clarity and absolute necessity. The world had taught him that predators respected only superior predation. That evening, Derek received an unexpected visitor at his compound. Lucia Rodriguez arrived unannounced, carrying a bottle of expensive whiskey and wearing an expression Derek couldn't read. "I have news you're not going to like," she said without preamble. Derek poured 2 glasses and waited. "Margaret Chun is writing a book about Kyle's death. She's been investigating what really happened to her grandson, and she's getting close to the truth." Derek sipped his whiskey calmly. "How close?" "Close enough to be dangerous. She's connected Kyle's death to your consulting work, identified some of your shell companies, and documented the timeline of events surrounding the affair. She's also been in contact with journalists." Derek set down his glass. Margaret Chun was Kyle's maternal grandmother, an elderly woman who'd shown little interest in her grandson while he was alive. But grief could motivate people in unexpected ways. "Recommendations?" Derek asked. "She's 73 years old, lives alone, and has no family left except some distant cousins. A natural death wouldn't raise suspicions." Derek considered the options. Margaret Chin posed a real threat to his operational security, but she was also a grieving grandmother trying to find meaning in her family's destruction. Killing her would be operationally sound, but unnecessary if other solutions existed. Alternative approaches. Discredit her. Plant evidence of dementia. Create a history of false accusations. Make her appear unreliable. The book becomes the ravings of a senile old woman seeking someone to blame for her family's self-destruction. Derek nodded. Implement the alternative. If it fails, we'll reconsider permanent solutions. Lucia finished her whiskey and stood to leave. "You know, Derek, sometimes I wonder if we've gone too far. Kyle was just a kid who made bad choices." Derek met her eyes without flinching. Kyle was 19 years old enough to vote, serve in military combat, and choose loyalty over betrayal. He chose betrayal and paid the price. And Brenda? Brenda was a predator who tried to destroy me using my own son as a weapon. Her death was irrelevant. Lucia nodded and walked toward the door. "I'll handle the grandmother situation. But Derek, consider that someday someone might decide you're the monster that needs to be stopped." Derek watched her leave, then returned to his study. Lucia's warning was prescient but irrelevant. Derek had long ago accepted that his path would eventually lead to violent death. The only question was whether he'd die as predator or prey. 6 months later, Margaret Chin's book was published by a small press and dismissed by reviewers as conspiracy theory. The elderly woman was portrayed in media coverage as a grieving relative who'd created elaborate fantasies to cope with her family's self-destruction. She died of a stroke 3 weeks after the book's release, taking her secrets to the grave. Derek never read the book, but Lucia's team ensured that every copy was removed from circulation within a year. The official narrative remained unchanged. Kyle Holloway had destroyed himself through poor choices, Brenda had died from addiction and homelessness, and Derek had simply moved on with his life. The truth was buried with the people who'd lived it. Derek continued his work across Europe and Asia, building a reputation that earned him contracts from governments and corporations that needed problems eliminated permanently. He accumulated wealth, power, and respect from people who understood that some services couldn't be purchased through conventional channels. But late at night, in the silence of his secure compound, Derek sometimes remembered the man he'd been before Kyle's laughter and Brenda's betrayal had transformed him. That man had believed in forgiveness, second chances, and the possibility of redemption. Derek felt no nostalgia for those beliefs. The world had taught him that forgiveness was weakness, second chances were invitations for further betrayal, and redemption was a luxury that predators exploited. Derek Holloway had become exactly what the world required him to be, a predator so dangerous that other predators gave him respectful distance. His enemies were dead or forgotten, his reputation was unassailable, and his skills were in constant demand. Some might call him a monster, but Derek preferred to think of himself as evolution in action. The weak perished, the strong survived, and the strongest thrived by understanding that mercy was just another word for defeat. Derek had learned that lesson in a suburban house where his wife and son had laughed about disposing of him. Now he carried that lesson into a world where such knowledge was the difference between hunter and prey. The game was never really over. There were always new enemies to destroy, new betrayals to punish, and new predators who needed to learn why Derek Holloway was the most dangerous man they'd ever encounter. Derek was no longer capable of forgiveness, but he was supremely capable of survival. In a world full of predators, that was the only skill that truly mattered. The hunter remained undefeated, and his prey had learned too late that some men could never be betrayed twice. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.